Welcome to Section 3. In this section, we're going to talk about cluster analysis. Specifically, in this section, we're going to take a look at the purpose, goals, and applications of cluster analysis. After that, we're going to talk about the basics. How do you do cluster analysis? Why would you do it? From there, we'll talk about different types of cluster analysis models. After that, we're going to have a demonstration of how to use k-means. We're then going to talk about how to interpret the results of k-means. And finally, we're going to talk about how to use additional fields to create a cluster profile. In this video, we're going to talk about purpose, goals, and applications of cluster analysis. Specifically, in this video, we're going to talk about the general purpose of cluster analysis. Why would you do it? We're also going to talk about its goals. Really, what are you trying to get out of the cluster analysis? And finally, we're going to talk about how cluster analysis is used. Cluster analysis is an exploratory technique that tries to reveal natural groupings of cases within the data. Its main advantage is that it's going to try to find groupings that are not apparent. And the way it's going to do this is it's going to segment data into different groups of records that have similar patterns on the variables that you find to be important. Now, the main idea here is that rather than looking at the entire data set and treating everybody as being similar or within that same group, we're going to create these different subgroups. So the idea is that objects or cases in the same cluster are going to be more similar to each other than cases in another cluster. And so ultimately what cluster analysis does is it separates different groups so that it creates these homogeneous groups within a cluster relatively similar to each other, and it separates them and categorizes them so that we have different types of people. So we're not assuming, for example, that we have the same types of students or the same types of customers. Instead, we have different students or customers or whatever it happens to be that have these different patterns within the data. Now, the goals of cluster analysis are really three reasons why you do cluster analysis. The first is really that you just want to identify and define your clusters. So again, rather than just treating everybody as being similar, we know that there are these different patterns within our cases, within our data, and we want to identify these different patterns and create these different groups so that we can look at them differently and see how they really behave. A second reason why you might do cluster analysis is that cluster analysis may not be the end goal in and of itself. Instead, you might do a cluster analysis. You see these different groups, you identify them, but then you use that cluster field and you use that as another variable in a predictive or associative model. So again, knowing that extra piece of information, it's just another variable that you can use to try to improve the predictive models that you're building. A third reason why you might do cluster analysis is that you take the perspective that these clusters or groups are so different from each other that you really need to separate each group and create different predictive or association models for each cluster. So the idea there is that building one model for the entire data set is not really good enough. Instead, these groups are so different that they're going to have different patterns within our variables of interest that we really need to create separate models for each group. And so you're basically almost using a cluster analysis as really a way to separate these different groups and create different models for each one of them. Now, in terms of applications for cluster analysis, first and foremost, it's been used in market research. So, for example, we may find that there are different buying patterns for our customers, and we may want to create different marketing campaigns for each one of them so that we don't all get the same advertisements, but the advertisements are targeted. As an example, a few years ago, I worked on a project where we were doing political targeting, and rather than approaching each potential voter with the same piece of information, we targeted the voters so that those voters that were more interested in social issues got information on the social issues of these different candidates, and those voters that were more interested in economic issues got information on the financial or economic stances of these different candidates. So again, your marketing becomes much more targeted and specific to those people that might be interested in that. Another way you can use cluster analysis is you can use it in plant and animal ecology. So again, we want to just separate these different plants or animals into different species and genus and so forth. We can do that by doing cluster analysis, seeing what characteristics certain plants share with each other and things like that, so that we can create these different families. Another example of how we could use cluster analysis is in PET scans, for example. So again, we're seeing these different clusters maybe in terms of brain activity and things like that. Another area where you could use cluster analysis is we might be looking at service and product usage patterns. So we may have a group of outpatients, for example, and we want to see what services they use. And that way we can see, whether we have some people that are users of all different types of services, or maybe they only use some specific services and things like that. We also can use cluster analysis for social network analysis. We could use it for crime analysis to kind of find out where different crimes are taking place within a city and things like that. Or we may want to use cluster analysis for anomaly detection, not only to identify outliers, for example, but we could use it to identify things like cases of fraud, or where something unusual is happening. For example, a few years ago, I worked on a project where we were trying to identify cargo containers that were carrying illegal items.